I'll make you a director if you translate this contract from Chinese right now in front of everyone. Harrison Ford's voice echoed through the grand ballroom of the Imperial Hotel in downtown Chicago. He held up a document written in Chinese. Laughter erupted like thunder. Every sneer was directed at Grace Miller, a cleaning lady who held her trembling hands under her nose. Dear friends, I want to get to know those who are listening to me right now. Please write which city or country you are from. It is very important and interesting for me to get to know my audience better. Enjoy the listening, everyone. Grace felt the ground slipping from under her feet. She had never been the center of attention, especially in a hall full of people in expensive suits and glittering jewelry. Her gray work robe seemed a disgrace among the evening dresses and crystal glasses. This public humiliation left no way out. She had to answer. Harrison Ford smiled with self-satisfaction, certain that she would remain silent, that she would wither under the mockery. But Grace, breathing heavily and not taking her eyes off the paper, took a deep breath. What began as a cruel joke was turning into a duel that would be remembered for a long time. In the hall, glasses clinked and fabrics of dresses shimmered when a low laugh cut through the air like a whip crack. Impeccably dressed, with his gray hair slicked back, Harrison Ford tapped his knuckles on the marble table. The executives at the table laughed obediently with him, picking up his tone. Before them stood the motionless Grace Miller. Her uniform still smelled of cheap soap. Her hands were clenched, her fingers trembling, her gaze cast down. She had only entered to collect empty glasses, but now she found herself in the ruthless light of others' mockery. Look at her, Ford's voice boomed over the hall as he held up the contract. Take a good look. Today this woman has a chance to shine, if, of course, she can read anything other than the labels on detergent bottles. Laughter washed over the table again. Julian Bennett, one of the top managers, slammed his glass against the tablecloth, nearly choking with laughter. Audrey Ford shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding her father's gaze. Grace compressed her lips. She wanted to vanish, to fall through the floor, but her feet felt as if they were rooted to the marble. Her breathing became shallow, as if each new burst of laughter stole her air. Ford leaned forward, smirking venomously. Come on, woman, prove that you're good for more than just mopping floors. Translate this contract right here, from Chinese into English. If you handle it, I will appoint you director of my holding company. Instantly, silence fell, and then another wave of laughter rolled through. The idea seemed so absurd that the guests took it as the perfect joke of the evening. Clara Higgins, another employee who was bringing drinks, wanted to approach, but Grace raised her hand slightly, asking her not to interfere. Her pride was wounded, but she was still standing. She raised her head, her tired dark eyes meeting Ford's gaze. What if I try? She whispered in a trembling voice. The laughter grew louder. Julian doubled over with laughter, and Miles Sterling, adjusting his glasses, smirked. Harrison Ford, enjoying the performance, threw the contract in front of her. The thud of the paper against the table sounded like a challenge. Go ahead, surprise us if you can. Grace hesitantly reached for the document. The papers were heavy. The lines consisted entirely of dense legal phrasing. Her heart was pounding, but her eyes began to scan the lines, as if an old memory was waking up. The whispers of the guests died down. The woman everyone thought was incapable of stringing two words together in Chinese was about to speak. Grace's chest rose and fell as she fought her fear, until Ford's firm voice cut through the silence. Well, come on, don't keep us waiting. Or show everyone that you are as useless as we thought. Grace took a deep breath. Her throat was dry, but the Chinese words began to assemble in her memory as if they had been slumbering deep inside. The hall froze, as if it had stopped breathing. If this story touched you, write in the comments which city you are watching us from, and don't forget to like to support the channel. The contract lay on the table like a cursed object, thick, with a seal, looking more like a trap than a document. All looked at it with grim interest, waiting to see how the cleaning lady would suffer the most humiliating defeat of her life. Harrison Ford leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a satisfied emperor. In his eyes, malice sparked. He was sure that this evening would be remembered as his best joke. To make it clear to everyone, he said, raising his chin. If this woman can translate every line of this Chinese contract right here, I will appoint her director of Ford Enterprise Group. Cruel laughter rolled through the hall again. Julian Bennett applauded as if the billionaire had told the best joke of the night. Some guests even pounded the table with laughter. Audrey Ford frowned but did not dare to object to her father. Grace stood motionless, pressing her fingers to the pages of the contract and feeling the heat of a dozen stares. Every laugh pierced her chest like a needle. From the corner, Clara tried to catch her eye to support her, but Grace did not raise her head. She knew, show weakness, and all will be lost. Harrison Ford did not relent, leaning closer. Do you accept my challenge, or will you go back to your mops? Grace swallowed with difficulty. Her throat was dry, but her lips flickered and spoke with a determination unexpected even to herself. I accept. Silence fell instantly, thick as smoke. The ticking of a clock could be heard somewhere far away. The laughter died down. The guests leaned forward, holding their breath. Julian's eyes widened. He couldn't believe she dared to agree. Harrison raised an eyebrow, smirking wider, certain that the show was just beginning. Excellent. Then start right now. He pushed the papers toward her sharply, and the pages scattered across the table. Grace took a deep breath, trying to calm her trembling hands. Every word in Chinese seemed like an impregnable wall, but somewhere deep inside, an echo of youth, a forgotten spark, flared up. She remembered the years of study, the sleepless nights when she translated texts and dreamed of a different life. Now she had no right to make a mistake. Not this time. The noise of the guests' voices rose again in a wave. Miles Sterling muttered with mockery in his voice, "Let's see how this turns out." Grace ran her fingers along the edge of the contract. The paper burned her palms, but her lips were already beginning to form the first words in Chinese. The guests leaned forward, impatiently waiting for a stumble, embarrassment, or shame, anything that would confirm their confidence. But as soon as she opened her mouth, Harrison Ford raised his glass and mockingly commanded, "Everyone, quiet. I want to hear every word of this masterpiece." The hall froze. Tension hung in the air, sharp as a blade. Grace closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and began to speak. She held the contract with both hands as if it might crumble into dust at any moment. Her fingers were trembling so violently that some guests decided she wouldn't utter a single word. The agreement between she whispered, stumbling only at the very beginning. Immediately, the first bursts of laughter broke out. Julian Bennett covered his mouth with a napkin, laughing so hard he could barely breathe, while a woman in a red dress whispered mockingly, "The poor thing can't even pronounce it." Grace compressed her lips, took a deep breath, and tried again, this time with more confidence. The noise in the hall died down. Miles Sterling raised his eyebrows. The pronunciation wasn't perfect, but it was clear and surprisingly accurate for someone everyone considered illiterate. Ford pretended to be bored and contemptuously threw out, "Continue, woman. We've only just begun." And Grace continued. The contract lay open on the table as her voice rang out again. "The understanding of the terms and conditions," she said, still shaking slightly but with growing confidence. The guests, who had expected her to fail immediately, began to exchange surprised glances. The laughter gradually died away, giving way to a tense silence. Audrey Ford leaned forward, her eyes wide. She had never seen her father allow himself to mock someone like this, and she certainly didn't expect his challenge to be accepted with such calm resolve. In the corner, Clara Higgins gripped her tray tightly. Her lips silently whispered, "Hold on, Grace, hold on." Suddenly, Grace looked up from the paper. She was no longer just reading, she was translating aloud without hesitation. "This agreement between the countries is valid and binding. The signing party accepts the terms and conditions." An icy silence rolled through the hall. The Chinese words sounded natural, something no one expected. A humble cleaning lady was doing what even the top managers feared to do. She understood what was written in the document. Julian Bennett stopped laughing. The sound of laughter got stuck in his throat. Miles Sterling leaned closer, squinting, trying to catch a mistake, but found none. Harrison Ford crossed his arms and gave a strained smirk. "That's just the basics," he said coldly. "Let's see how long your little performance lasts." Grace looked down again, but a fire burned in her eyes. She remembered the nights when she secretly practiced translations, dreaming of becoming a professional until life pushed her into the world of restrooms and buckets. Every word she spoke seemed to return a piece of her forgotten past. The hall was divided. Some were still waiting for her to stumble, others were beginning to feel ashamed of their laughter. Audrey whispered, almost unconsciously, "Dad, you should stop." But Ford brushed her off with a sharp movement of his hand. "Be quiet, Audrey. The most interesting part is just beginning." Grace spoke again. "Failure to comply will result in legal action before the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague." Sterling's eyes widened. This was no simple phrase, it was a complex legal formulation, and she translated it flawlessly. A murmur went through the hall. The weight of humiliation began to shift onto other shoulders. Ford was still smiling, but through his mask of self-assurance, irritation began to show. Grace took a breath, preparing to continue, when she suddenly noticed something on the page that had escaped everyone else's attention. She ran her finger along the lines, making sure she wasn't mistaken. The words lined up clearly in her head. Her voice filled the hall again. "The company reserves the right to terminate the contract at a later date." A strange silence hung over the table. Several people turned to Ford. This line was no small detail, it clearly pointed to an inequality between the parties. Even Sterling, who prided himself on his attentiveness, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't expect a cleaning lady to understand the contract better than him. A coincidence? Julian muttered, trying to lighten the atmosphere. The laughter sounded fake, but Grace didn't stop. "The undersigned waives the right to trial under local jurisdiction." The glasses on the tables remained motionless. Some guests lowered their eyes, ashamed of how they had laughed just a few minutes ago. Audrey looked at her father, unable to believe her eyes. Every new sentence was an invisible blow, a crack in Ford's self-confidence. Although he still kept that same frozen, performative smile on his face, the mask was beginning to crumble. "Fine," Harrison Ford said, his voice harsher now. "Keep going. I want to hear more." Grace took a deep breath. She felt every gaze piercing her like a knife, but something stronger than fear had already awakened inside her. She was no longer just translating, she was exposing the true nature of the contract. Every line was a trap, and now she was showing it to everyone. In the corner, Clara couldn't hold back a smile. Her friend was no longer an invisible woman. At that moment, Grace seemed taller, stronger, as if the gray robe could no longer hide her dignity. "In case of dispute, the language of arbitration shall be," she said steadily. The translation flowed like a river. A wave of anxious whispering rolled through the hall. Some of the guests, foreign investors, immediately understood what this meant. A contract written this way left anyone who didn't speak Chinese defenseless. Harrison tapped his fingers irritably on the table. "And is that all you're capable of? Just repeating what's written?" Grace looked at him with a calm gaze that no one expected. "I am not repeating," she said. "I am explaining. This contract forces people to accept unfair conditions, stripping them of the right to defend themselves in their own language." An immediate silence fell over the hall, heavy and stifling. The courage to say such a thing seemed unthinkable. Audrey covered her mouth with her hand, stunned. The guests looked at each other. No one dared to laugh. For the first time that evening, Ford's laughter found no echo. The hall had ceased to be an arena for a cruel joke, it had turned into a makeshift courtroom. Ford's gaze became hard. He realized he was losing control. His voice dripped with venom. "Fine, Miller. Since you think you're so smart, let's see if you can handle something truly difficult." He leaned toward Miles Sterling, who opened another folder and placed a new sheet in front of Grace, a solid paragraph of legal jargon, a labyrinth designed to break her. The guests held their breath. The game was becoming even more brutal. Harrison Ford struck the table with his palm. The sound echoed like a sentence. Miles Sterling, obedient and serious, slid a page toward her, covered in fine print, abbreviations, and complex terms incomprehensible even to many present. "If you are truly that smart," Ford said with a crooked smirk, "translate this. There are no simple phrases here. This is where we find out who is brilliant and who was born to be a servant." An anxious hum rolled through the hall. Some shook their heads, admitting that everything had gone too far. Others, loyal to the businessman, leaned forward, finally expecting to see her defeat. Grace Miller gripped the sheet. The lines merged into a tangle of clauses and abbreviations designed to confuse. The pressure squeezed her chest. Her hands shook, but she did not let go of the document. Clara Higgins took a step forward but stopped. Meeting her friend's firm gaze, she realized Grace didn't need protection. She needed to prove that even with fear, one could stand tall. Julian Bennett laughed loudly. "Look, she's gone numb. That's what happens when you pretend to be a lawyer." Grace looked directly at him. She didn't answer, but her silence sounded louder than any words. She breathed in again and looked down at the page. The Chinese words swirled before her eyes, but her memory guided her. Back in the university, the professors had said that legal texts were the most difficult to translate. And she remembered those nights when her son slept beside her. She had studied by the dim light of an old lamp. At first, her voice wavered, but an inner strength already resonated within it. The silence in the hall became as dense as the air before a storm. No one dared to smirk. Audrey Ford pressed her palm to her chest, deeply moved. Grace's voice no longer sounded like the voice of a humiliated woman. It was the voice of a person who carried pain and had finally found a way out. Miles Sterling frowned. He realized this was no accident. She truly understood the text. But Ford had no intention of backing down. "This is only the beginning," he spat venomously. "Continue if you can." Grace lowered her eyes and continued, "The compensation or indemnity in case of." The hall froze. The woman everyone thought was doomed to humiliation now stood straight, holding her own dignity in her hands. Julian Bennett shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the mockery had vanished from his face. Ford gripped his glass so hard the crystal creaked. He couldn't bear the thought that a woman he considered insignificant was demonstrating knowledge he didn't possess in front of everyone. Grace raised her head, breathing heavily, but she did not retreat. This was no longer a translation, it was a battle for the right to be heard. And somewhere deep within her memories, a secret from her past began to stir, waiting for its hour. She slowly lowered the sheet. Her breath was ragged, as if every word had been a mountain she had to climb. Absolute silence stood in the hall. Only one glass clinked somewhere on a far table. All eyes were fixed on her. In some, there was admiration, in others, shame, in others, disbelief. No one could deny the obvious. This woman had translated impossible phrases with such clarity that she had destroyed the last traces of mockery. Harrison Ford was not going to give up. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and a crooked, cold smile appeared on his lips. "Tell the truth," he said in a low, gruff voice. "Who helped you? Who whispered these words to you?" Grace looked him straight in the eyes. Her hands were still shaking, but there was no fear left in her gaze, only exhaustion and dignity. "No one helped me." Julian smirked nervously. "Oh, come on," he said, choking on a nervous laugh. "Who would believe that a cleaning lady understands legal terms in Chinese?" Someone else awkwardly picked up the laugh, but it quickly died out. The majority sat in silence, waiting. Grace compressed her lips, lowered her eyes for a moment, and said steadily, "I studied at the Faculty of Foreign Languages at Georgetown University." These words hit like thunder. A whisper rolled through the hall. Audrey opened her eyes in surprise, and even Miles Sterling took off his glasses as if to make sure he hadn't misheard. Ford laughed dryly and venomously. University? You? And when did you trade classrooms for a mop? Grace swallowed. The question cut with pain, but there was no turning back. I got pregnant at 19 years old. I had a son. I had to feed him, treat him, and pay for housing. I dropped out of my studies and took any job to buy him food and medicine. A heavy silence filled the hall. The guests looked at each other. Someone lowered their head. Suddenly, the woman everyone had considered insignificant turned out to be a person with a past full of sacrifice and pain. Audrey spoke in a trembling voice, "That doesn't make her any less worthy, Dad." Ford ignored his daughter, casting a gaze at Grace as sharp as a knife. "So, you gave up your career for a child and now you think you have a place at my table?" Grace took a deep breath. Her eyes shimmered, but she did not look away. "I don't think anything. You were the one who challenged me to humiliate me. And now that I've proven I can, you're looking for a new reason to crush me." The words sounded like a lashing strike. Some guests nodded silently, others shifted in their seats. Ford's self-assurance now looked not like strength, but like cruelty. In the corner, Clara Higgins felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to clap, to scream, to hug her friend, but she held back. She knew the battle wasn't over yet. Ford clenched his jaws in irritation. "Fine, Miller. Since you're so proud of your unfinished education, translate the next text." Miles Sterling handed her a new sheet, even more complex, overflowing with clauses about liability and compensation. This was the final trap. Grace took the paper. Her hands were cold, but her eyes burned. She knew this wasn't just a test. It was her chance to reclaim at least a part of the dignity that life had taken from her. When she spoke, the hall froze. The paper crinkled in her fingers. The lines on the sheet seemed like a labyrinth ready to swallow her. The phrases were peppered with terms like force majeure, indemnification, arbitration, and liquidated damages. Such a text could make even experienced lawyers falter. Ford leaned back in his chair, interlacing his fingers, feigning calmness. "Go on, woman," he said with contempt. "This is where it will be revealed who is the real thing and who is pretending." Sterling watched her with growing concern. He understood that this paragraph was no joke. Precision was required here, and if she succeeded, the evening would turn against his boss. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. Her breath wavered, but memory brought her back to the years of her youth, the mornings, the textbooks, and her son sleeping nearby. "Don't give up, Mom," a voice from the past seemed to whisper. She opened her eyes, inhaled, and began. "In the event of a merger, the party shall be liable for any failure or delay in performance." The entire hall froze. No one expected such precision. She continued without hesitation, including but not limited to natural disasters, war, or governmental actions. The guests looked at each other, stunned. Some nodded quietly, acknowledging that the translation was flawless. Audrey, holding back tears, whispered, "She's doing it." Clara pressed her tray to her chest, trembling with pride. Grace continued, "The breaching party shall indemnify the other party for any liquidated damages in this." Her voice faltered, but she quickly composed herself. Sterling's eyes widened in astonishment. There were no mistakes. Every word was in its place, as if under a magnifying glass. A murmur went through the hall. The laughter vanished. Now people looked on with respect and shame. Humiliation had turned into a public lesson. Ford, sitting motionless, struck the table with his fist. "Enough," he bellowed. But it was too late. Grace looked him straight in the eyes and calmly said, "This contract was created to strip people of their rights. You knew this, and today, in front of everyone, the truth has come to light." Her words cut like a blade. No one dared to utter a sound. Glasses froze, and silverware hung mid-air. Ford's face turned red. The mask of superiority began to crack. Grace Miller, who had endured humiliation with a strength no one could have imagined, watched as Julian Bennett, the eternal sycophant, slowly sank into his chair, unable to meet his boss's eyes. Audrey Ford stood up. Her words were almost a whisper. "Dad, enough." The silence was so thick that one could hear Grace's ragged breathing. She had achieved the impossible. There was no longer any doubt. What began as a cruel mockery had turned into a test of dignity. All eyes were fixed on Harrison Ford. He found himself in a position he couldn't have imagined, held captive by public disgrace. The echo of Grace's last words hung in the air like a sharp blade over the richly set table. No one dared to move. It felt as if the entire hall was frozen before a truth too heavy to hide. Harrison Ford sat motionless, his jaw clenched. His eyes burned with restrained fury. For decades, he had enjoyed the easy laughter of guests, the unconditional obedience of subordinates, and fear disguised as respect. But now, before a woman in a gray uniform, his power was crumbling into dust. Julian was the first to lower his gaze. The eternal flatterer no longer found anything funny. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, wishing he could sink through the floor. Audrey, folding her arms in front of her, took a step toward her father. Her voice trembled but remained firm. "Dad, we all saw it. You can't deny this." Some guests nodded silently, others looked away, fearing the host's wrath but unable to hide their awkwardness. The humiliation was no longer Grace's, now it belonged to him. She stood straight, breathing heavily, not smiling or triumphing. Her dark eyes shimmered not from victory, but from exhaustion. She had endured the laughter, stood firm under the weight of every mocking glance, and still stood unbroken. Clara Higgins could no longer hold back. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "Enough. She didn't deserve this. No woman deserves such humiliation." The silence grew even deeper. Even Ford's most loyal supporters hesitated. The businessman leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table. His voice sounded hoarse, saturated with anger. "Do you even realize who you are talking to? I don't owe anyone an explanation." But there was no power left in his words. The hall no longer looked at him with admiration, only with judgment as heavy as a sentence. Miles Sterling coughed awkwardly. "Mr. Ford," she translated everything without a single mistake. "There is nothing to dispute." That sentence was the final blow. A hum went through the hall, the sound of shattering self-importance. Some guests pushed their glasses away, others pretended to talk just to avoid being part of the host's disgrace. Audrey took a deep breath and, for the first time, addressed Grace directly. "Grace, thank you for telling the truth." Grace looked at her in surprise, not knowing how to answer. No one had ever thanked her simply for saying aloud what she thought. Ford slammed his fist on the table with a crash. "This is a circus," he barked, but his voice no longer sounded authoritative. Now he sounded like a man who had lost control. Grace did not retreat. "You said yourself that you would make me a director if I translated it. And I translated it." Her words sounded like a gunshot. The guests held their breath. Audrey turned to her father. In her voice, there was both sadness and defiance. "Keep your word, Dad." The silence became unbearable. Everyone waited for his reaction. For the first time in his career, Ford found himself backed into a corner with no way out. And he knew it. The contract lying on the table was no longer a symbol of mockery, but a witness to his humiliation. Grace stood tall with her head held high. Her hands were still shaking, but her gaze remained firm. She didn't need to raise her voice. The power of her dignity sounded louder than any words. "Do what you promised," she repeated calmly. "You said that if I translated it, you would appoint me director." A murmur rolled through the hall. Some guests smiled nervously, others shifted in their seats. No one expected that a mocking promise would return to haunt him. Ford clenched his jaw, his fingers tapping spasmodically on the tablecloth. He wanted to laugh, to shout that it was all a joke, but dozens of gazes held him captive. If he broke his word, his reputation would collapse. Audrey stepped closer. "Father," everyone heard. "If you don't keep your promise, you are no longer a man of your word." These words struck directly at the heart of his pride. The hum in the hall intensified. "Not a man of his word," some whispered. Miles Sterling lowered his head. He understood that any excuses would only deepen the shame. Grace didn't ask for anything extra, didn't beg, and didn't demand, she just stood and waited. Her silence sounded louder than any arguments. Finally, Ford rose. His chair scraped against the marble. The sound echoed through the hall. Slowly, he walked around the table and stood directly in front of her. His gaze was heavy, filled with wounded pride. "Fine, Miller," he said in a gruff voice. "If this is what you want, from this minute on, you are the new director of Ford Enterprise Group." These words struck the hall like thunder. The guests looked at each other, someone muttered in amazement. Julian sat with his mouth open, unable to utter a single word. The world they knew had just turned upside down. In the corner, Clara could not hold back her tears. Her friend, the very woman with whom she had mopped floors side by side until exhaustion, had achieved the impossible. Grace listened in silence. She did not smile, and she did not celebrate. Her gaze remained fixed, focused on the businessman. "This is not what I want," she answered quietly. "It is what you promised." These words seemed to stop time. In them, there was neither pride nor defiance, only justice. Audrey stepped closer and gently took her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Today you showed us what true courage is." One by one, the guests began to applaud. At first hesitantly, then louder and louder, as if they were applauding not just a victory, but a lesson that both shamed and inspired them. Grace took a deep breath, allowing the applause to wash away the pain of countless invisible wounds from her soul. Harrison Ford stood motionless, captured by a scene he could not have even dreamed of. He had lost the laughter, the control, and, most painfully, the power right in front of everyone. In this applause, a new balance was established. Power had changed hands. As the echo of the clapping filled the hall, only one final gesture remained, the one that would define not only the end of this evening but the fate of everyone present. Grace stood motionless, her hands trembling slightly, but her gaze remained calm. The echo of the applause still rang within the walls as the guests slowly dispersed, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Clara Higgins approached and gently took her friend's arm. She said nothing, simply looking at her with eyes full of tears, as if she knew that any words would be too small for this evening. Nearby stood Audrey Ford, watching her father with sadness and compassion. She saw how his pride had collapsed, how the man she considered unshakable turned silent before the dignity of the woman he wanted to crush. Harrison Ford did not move. The man who at the beginning of the evening seemed omnipotent now looked smaller, almost fragile. His jaw was clenched, his eyes lowered to the tablecloth, and his hands were frozen on the table's surface. No one dared to speak to him. Grace breathed in again. She was not seeking applause or positions. All she wanted was for this evening to be remembered as proof that dignity cannot be bought and cannot be taken away, that even silent pain, if given a chance, can be heard. She crossed the hall with steady steps. Each step echoed across the marble floor, creating a rhythm that no one present would ever forget. Before exiting, she turned back one last time. Her and Ford's eyes met. In her eyes, there was neither hatred nor malice, only a quiet truth that wounded more than any words. The doors of the hall closed behind her, and the night breeze rushed into the room like a breath of freedom. Outside, the lights of Chicago flickered indifferently, but for Grace, the sky glowed differently, with the light of reclaimed dignity that no one would ever be able to take from her again. And inside, among the empty glasses and heavy silence, sat a millionaire for whom silence had become not a weapon, but a punishment. This night remained forever in the memory of all who saw it. What began as a cruel mockery turned into a revelation. Dignity does not depend on the uniform you wear, but on the courage to defend your voice. Harrison Ford thought he could humiliate a simple woman before a room full of power and wealth, but in the end, it was he who remained stripped bare by his own pride. Grace Miller, with a pure heart and quiet strength, did not just translate an impossible contract, she turned the pain of her life into a lesson of hope and redemption. Because true greatness is not in money or titles, but in the ability to respect, forgive, and hold your head high even when the whole world laughs at you. If this story touched you, please support our channel, click thanks or super thanks. If the button is not visible, click the 3 dots nearby. Your every support helps us create new stories and share them with even more people. Thank you for being with us until the end. Write in the comments which moment touched you the most. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Give us a like if you believe in the invisible power of dignity and family.